Gracious God, may the thoughts that you've put on my heart be the words for these your people this day and tomorrow. When Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, the electric light bulb, in 1879, I wonder if he understood how such an easy-to-ignite light would change the world. His carbonized filaments of baywood, cedar, and bamboo would become a staple of life by the 20th century, as this country expanded its electric grid across the continent into every city and town and village in the country. The earliest electric headlights in automobiles came out almost 20 years later in 1898. The company electric-powered headlights were an optional accessory from Columbia, the electric vehicle company. And electric headlights were a small step in the right direction. They weren't very functional until much later, when Cadillac introduced the Delco electric ignition and lighting system in 1912. This made electric lights and headlights in automobiles an effective means to see what was going on in front of you. So I owned an auto repair shop back in the 1980s. And one of our functions was to perform New York State inspections on all automobiles. Part of the inspection process was to check the aim of the vehicle's headlights. We parked the vehicle on a nice level spot and checked the aiming of the headlights so that, of all of the headlights, because some of the cars in the 1980s had 4 headlights on them. A high beam and a low beam headlight on each side of the vehicle. We had a special tool. It clamped on each headlight and measured the elevation of the beam ahead of the vehicle and the left to right adjustment of each beam. If the headlights were aimed too low, then the driver couldn't see far enough in front of the vehicle at night to avoid any obstacles that might be hidden there. If they were aimed too high, the drivers in oncoming traffic would be blinded by the light from this vehicle. If the headlights were aimed as far, we always wanted the headlights to be aimed towards the shoulder on the side of the road. If they were too far towards the shoulder, then the driver couldn't see what was out in front of him. And if they were too far towards the center of the road, they would again distract the drivers of oncoming traffic. By aiming those headlights properly, we were helping the drivers of the vehicles to get the best possible light for night vision, while minimizing the effect of those lights on drivers in oncoming traffic. Things are a little different today. We have much more powerful headlights than those I inspected back in the 1980s. Some cars have automatic headlight dimming function to reduce the possibility of blinding drivers in oncoming vehicles. And they can even change the left and right aim of the headlights in order to allow a driver to see around a curve in the road ahead. Headlights for vehicles are important in our world, just like the lights that we have in our home and the lights that we have on our streets and businesses. But light was an important characteristic of God from the very beginning of time. God created light in the form of the sun in the daytime and the moon at night on the fourth day of creation. He used a rainbow, refracted sunlight, to seal his covenant with Noah, promising never to destroy the earth via a flood again in Genesis 9:13. Light in the ancient Near East was always natural light, sunlight, moonlight, starlight, lightning, and firelight were the only sources of light in Noah's day. God used light to announce the birth of his son in the form of that star. So later, in the Old Testament, lamps appeared, which were made almost exclusively of pottery. In the very earliest times, we read about lamps or saucers filled with olive oil in Exodus, on the rim of which rested a twist of thread. These simple lamps may have been used to light the tent of meeting that God established for the exiles as they were led by Moses through the desert. Sometime around 2000 BC, the first real lamps appeared. The saucers began to have rims, hinged in 4 places to form lips for holding the wicks. From the Middle Bronze Age onward, the lamp had a single lip, which became increasingly pinched. And in the Israelite period, the lamp required a base. 7-lipped lamps, such as those mentioned in Zechariah, also have been discovered by archaeologists. The first lamps in the temple may have been similar to these lamps, which were later joined on a common stem, from which the 7-branched lampstand or the menorah was developed. In our Old Testament reading this morning, God is telling the Israelites that they have to change their ways if they are to become the light he has planned for them to be unto the nations. Their unrighteous fasts are no longer acceptable. Their displays of piety simply draw attention to their practices of fasting and do not produce the righteous worship that God desires. The religious practice of fasting wasn't the problem. The problem was the spirit in which they carried out their fasts. A righteous and acceptable fast meant refraining from taking economic advantage of others and offering any assistance necessary for the health and dignity of all the people in the community. If the Israelites were to become God's light to the world, their religious practices must consider the plight of those around them who were not as fortunate as the people who were leading these worship practices. So Jesus' teaching to his disciples in Matthew are also about being righteous and going beyond what the scribes and the Pharisees were practicing. Being the salt of the earth means remaining faithful to Jesus, bringing the truth of his message to the world, and making that world a better place for everyone. Salt, like light, was another necessity of life in biblical times. Job asks, can that which is tasteless be eaten without salt? In addition to its use as a condiment, it was strewn on sacrifices, both cereal offerings and burnt offerings. Incense was to be seasoned with salt. Thus, salt appears on the list of provisions that are required for the temple. The custom of rubbing a newborn child with salt may have been for medicinal purposes. Possibly, maybe, it also had religious significance, such as to safeguard the child against demonic influences. In biblical times, salt was generally procured from the area of the Dead Sea. Zephaniah refers to the salt pits of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Ezekiel hears that although the Dead Sea is to be freshened in a new age, its swamps and marshes are to be left alone for their salt. The famous story of the transformation of Lot's wife into a pillar of salt in Genesis is probably a legend used to explain a natural rock salt formation in the area of Sodom and Gomorrah. The terms salt and saltiness and salty are often used as images for barrenness or desolation. This usage is derived from the practice of sowing vanquished cities or lands with salt, and it has parallels in Assyrian military history. Thus, the disobedient land is described as a brimstone and salt, a burnt-out waste, unsowing, and growing nothing. Conversely, life-giving and preservative qualities of salt are also mentioned. Elisha purifies the spring of Jericho with salt, so that neither death nor miscarriage shall come from it, in 2 Kings. The expression covenant of salt in Numbers and 2 Chronicles means a permanent covenant, since eating salt with someone means to be bound to him in loyalty. These positive uses of the term salt are also found in the New Testament. And here in our reading from Matthew, Jesus' description of the disciples as salt of the earth, in verse 13, calls them to remain in covenant with him. His followers must be the salt that defines the permanence of their covenant relationship with him and brings his message to the world. Similarly, being a light that is not hidden under a bushel, which sticks out like a city on a hill, is the second part of Jesus' message. Light removes the darkness. In the first century, almost all light was provided by oil lamps. Common oil lamps were those round-bodied Roman lamps with a nozzle that projects only slightly. These were followed by molded lamps with a square end in which the wick hole was made. These in turn gave way to oval or pear-shaped lamps. In late Roman and Byzantine times, lamps in the Hellenistic Roman period were normally smaller and more delicate than their earlier counterparts. And olive oil lamps and torches would light up the cities of Jesus' day. Moving on, in Matthew 5, verses 17 through 20, Jesus turns his disciples' attention to the law. Now, Jesus isn't against the law. He doesn't abolish or replace it. He shows how it is to be interpreted, and in this way fulfills it. Jesus uses the phrase the law and the prophets, which was understood in Jewish tradition as a designation for the Old Testament. The word law in Scripture is a translation of the Hebrew term Torah, which is best understood as an instruction. For the Jewish faithful, righteousness was traditionally associated with maintaining the commandments. And Jesus says that the righteous leaders have failed to keep the law, in spite of their claims to observe all of the commandments. Jesus' followers are expected to keep God's commandments even more faithfully than the legal experts and Pharisees of their day. who apparently focused on the details of the law without honoring its deeper significance. Jesus is teaching his disciples to go beyond the demands of the law and to be salt and light in a world to which he will send them. Their message is that he is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Jesus' greatest command is, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." This is the greatest and the first commandment. And the second is, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus said, "On these two commandments shall hang all the law and the prophets." So this is the commandment that goes beyond the law and brings people closer to God's kingdom. This is the commandment that Jesus needs for his disciples to be salty and bright light, salty salt and bright lights in the world, to bring that message of love and light to all people. He asks the disciples and us to reflect on the power we already have. You are salt. You are light. Now, do you want to be salt or do you want to be light? You already are. So given that declaration, how will we season? What will we light up? Jesus laid an expectation and a blessing on us as we are called to be the church. He said in the Sermon on the Mount that as his followers, we really don't have a choice about being salty or a shining light. We're not forced to be something against our will. What Jesus meant was that we are representatives of the church, whether we consciously try to claim that role or not. People, neighbors, friends, and strangers will look at us and think, "Oh, so that's what it means to be a part of the Christian faith." Or that's what belonging to the church means in terms of how we live in the world. Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth." Why not help things grow? You are the light of the world. Why not help folks find their way? Why not mentor? Why not lead? Why not be what you are? A sign of Christ's presence in the world today. Get out there, Jesus says. Out there in the world, the noisy, wonderful, scary, glorious world, and let your light shine. Don't worry about being trampled underfoot. That only happens when you stop being who you are called and created to be. We are all called to be salt that brings taste and light that brings love. Let our salt and light shine throughout this world. Amen.